Thunder, the family's black stallion, wasn't his usual laid-back self. Normally, he'd spend his mornings grazing or just standing there looking majestic, like he was posing for some fancy calendar. But today he was pacing his paddock like he was late for an important meeting. Inside the farmhouse, it was a different story. Baby Noah was having the time of his little life. He was kicking his tiny feet, chewing on his stuffed carrot toy, and giggling at nothing in particular. Noah's laugh could make anyone smile. It was that kind of laugh. The kind that reminded you that the world wasn't so bad after all. But outside, the world was starting to feel a little off. The chickens were acting weird. Usually they'd be scratching around for bugs, doing their usual chicken business. But not today. Today they were huddled together, clucking nervously like they'd just heard a piece of bad gossip. The goats, who were normally busy trying to break out of their pen, stood frozen, staring at the sky. Even the cows, who never seemed to care about anything, were shifting uneasily, their tails swishing faster than usual. "Looks like rain, Mr. Thompson," Noah's dad muttered as he stepped out of the barn. He glanced up at the sky, squinting at the dark clouds that were rolling in. Probably just a quick storm, nothing to worry about. Thunder wasn't so sure. Horses have instincts, and his were on high alert. Something about the way the air felt heavy and electric, like it was holding its breath, told him this wasn't just a regular storm. By early afternoon, the first raindrops started falling. Not the gentle kind that makes you want to dance around like in a movie. No, these were the big, heavy drops that slap against your face and make you wonder why you didn't bring an umbrella. Within minutes, those drops turned into a downpour. Thunder stomped his hooves and let out a sharp neigh. He could see the river from his paddock, and it wasn't behaving the way rivers should. Normally it flowed lazily along, perfect for fishing or skipping stones. But now, it was rising fast, twisting and churning like it had suddenly remembered it was supposed to be dangerous. Inside the house, the storm was barely a blip on anyone's radar. Noah's mom was closing the shutters, muttering about how the rain always seemed to show up when she had laundry to dry. "Typical," she said, shaking her head. "Just typical." Noah, of course, was still giggling, completely unaware of the chaos brewing outside. He kicked his little feet and waved his arms like he was having his own private party. Thunder kept pacing. His instincts told him to stay calm, but something deep inside whispered, "Get ready." He watched the rain pour harder, turning the dirt into mud and the paddock into a sloppy mess. He glanced back at the farmhouse, his eyes landing on the window where he could see Noah's crib. That baby was special. Thunder didn't know much about human babies, but he knew Noah was different. He'd watched over him from the moment they brought him home, always keeping an eye on him during sunny afternoons when they'd let Noah nap in his stroller under the shade of a tree. Thunder felt like it was his job to protect him. The storm picked up, and the wind started howling. It rattled the shutters and sent tree branches flying like oversized toothpicks. The river kept rising, spilling over its banks and creeping toward the paddock. Thunder stomped again, harder this time. He could feel it in his bones. This wasn't just any storm. It was the kind of storm that changed everything. And as Thunder stared at the farmhouse, at the baby inside who was still laughing like the world wasn't falling apart, he made a silent promise. No matter what happened, he'd keep that baby safe. The storm wasn't done yet. Not even close. The storm didn't let up. If anything, it got angrier. By nightfall, the wind howled like a pack of wolves, and the rain was pounding so hard it sounded like someone was throwing rocks at the roof. Inside the farmhouse, the Thompson family huddled together in the living room. Baby Noah, wrapped in a warm blanket, had finally fallen asleep in his cradle. His mom rocked it gently, humming a lullaby, while Mr. Thompson paced the room. "The river's rising too fast," he muttered, glancing at the door like it might burst open any second. Outside, the river was no longer just a river. It had transformed into a monster. The water tore through fences, uprooted trees, and carried away anything in its path. Thunder stood in his paddock, soaked to the bone, staring at the chaos. His instincts screamed at him, "This isn't safe." And then, it happened. The dam, the one that had always held the river in check, gave way with a sound like thunderclaps and roaring giants. In an instant, a wall of water surged forward, swallowing everything in its path. The farm didn't stand a chance. "Get to the attic," Mr. Thompson shouted, grabbing his wife's hand. She clutched Noah tightly, her face pale with fear. The water was already pouring in under the door, rising fast, too fast. Thunder's paddock was swept away in seconds. The powerful current broke the fence like it was made of twigs, and suddenly Thunder was free, but not in the way anyone would want. He fought against the swirling water, his strong legs kicking, his heart racing. From his position, he could see the farmhouse. He could see the family scrambling upstairs. And then, to his horror, he saw something else: Noah's cradle. In the chaos, the cradle had been knocked loose. One moment it was safe and sound, the next it was tumbling through the floodwaters like a tiny boat lost at sea. If you've ever felt your heart stop, you'll know what Thunder felt in that moment. Noah's mom screamed. The baby. Oh my God, the baby. But there was nothing she could do. The water was too strong, too wild. Mr. Thompson tried to hold her back as she lunged toward the window. "You'll drown," he shouted. We'll find him." But Thunder wasn't about to wait. Without a second thought, he plunged into the current. The icy water bit at his legs and chest, but he didn't care. His mind was locked on one thing: the cradle. He saw it bobbing in the distance, spinning and dipping dangerously close to being pulled under. Have you ever seen a horse swim? It's not something they do often, but when they do, it's powerful. Thunder kicked his legs hard, cutting through the water like a ship through waves. His ears were flat against his head, his mane plastered to his neck. The current was relentless. Debris floated past him: branches, barrels, even an old tire. At one point, a fallen tree nearly knocked him off course, but Thunder swerved at the last second, his eyes never leaving the cradle. Inside, Noah was still asleep. Miraculously, the blanket wrapped around him kept him snug and dry, but the cradle was tipping dangerously. Another wave hit it, almost flipping it over. Thunder pushed harder, his muscles burning, his lungs aching. He wasn't about to let that baby go. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Thunder reached the cradle. He nudged it gently with his nose, trying to steady it. The current fought back, pulling the cradle away, but Thunder didn't give up. He kept at it, using his body to shield the fragile wooden frame from the debris in the waves. And then, with a burst of strength, Thunder managed to push the cradle toward a floating piece of wood, a makeshift raft. Carefully, he positioned the cradle so it rested securely on top. It wasn't perfect, but it would do. The two of them drifted together, carried by the current. Thunder stayed close, his nose brushing the cradle every few seconds to make sure it was still there. The farmhouse was long out of sight. The flood had swallowed the farm completely, leaving nothing but water and destruction in its wake. Thunder didn't know where they were headed. He didn't know how far the water would take them or what dangers lay ahead. But he did know one thing: Noah was safe. For now. And that was enough to keep him going. The flood was relentless. Water churned and swirled, its roar deafening, like 1,000 waterfalls crashing all at once. Thunder swam through it, his powerful legs kicking against the current. His breath came in sharp bursts, each one carrying the weight of his determination. Noah's cries cut through the chaos like a tiny beacon. Faint, but enough to keep Thunder moving. The baby wasn't laughing now. His soft wails floated through the stormy night, piercing Thunder's heart. Have you ever chased after something, even when it felt impossible? That's what Thunder was doing. Every muscle in his body screamed for rest, but he ignored it. This wasn't just about survival. This was about Noah, the tiny human who had won his heart. As Thunder pushed forward, a massive branch floated toward him. He barely dodged it, twisting his body just in time. The branch smashed into a nearby tree trunk with a sound that made him flinch. This wasn't just a swim, it was a battle. And then, the predators came. In the distance, glowing eyes appeared on a piece of dry land, a small island sticking out of the flood. Wolves. A pack of them, stranded by the rising water. They looked thin and desperate, their ribs showing through their muddy fur. Thunder wasn't sure if they'd noticed him yet, but he wasn't about to take chances. He shifted his position, staying between the wolves and Noah's cradle. One of the wolves howled. The sound sent a chill down Thunder's spine. It wasn't just hunger in that cry, it was survival. The pack needed food, and they'd take whatever they could find. Thunder whinnied loudly, his voice cutting through the rain. It was a warning, a challenge. The wolves hesitated, their eyes darting between the powerful stallion and the drifting cradle. Finally, the current carried Thunder and Noah farther away, and the wolves disappeared into the shadows. The flood didn't let up. Debris floated everywhere, broken fences, pieces of roofs, and even an overturned tractor tire. Thunder's muscles burned, his energy draining fast. The cradle bobbed along beside him, and every time it tipped, Thunder nudged it back upright with his nose. As he swam, flashes of memories surfaced. He remembered the first time he'd seen Noah. The tiny baby had been bundled up in a blue blanket, his big eyes staring at the world like it was full of wonder. Thunder had trotted over, curious, and sniffed him gently. Noah had giggled, his tiny hand reaching out to touch Thunder's nose. But that giggle, it had become Thunder's favorite sound. He remembered the afternoons when Mrs. Thompson would lay a blanket under the big oak tree and let Noah nap. Thunder always stood close, his shadow covering the baby like a shield. He'd even shoo away curious chickens who got too close, flicking his tail to keep them in line. Those moments fueled him now. Every kick, every push through the water was for the baby who had made his heart feel bigger than it ever had before. But even Thunder had limits. His legs grew heavier with each stroke, and his breaths came faster. The cold water seeped into his muscles, slowing him down. At one point, he almost let the current carry him away, but then he heard it again, Noah's cry. It wasn't loud. It wasn't strong. But it was there. Thunder forced himself to keep going. He spotted a fallen tree up ahead, its wide trunk sticking out of the water like a bridge to nowhere. He swam toward it, hoping it would give him a moment to rest. Carefully, he guided the cradle toward the tree, wedging it into a nook where it wouldn't drift away. For a moment, Thunder rested, his head low, water dripping from his soaked mane. The tree provided a bit of shelter from the current, and the cradle was safe for now. But the storm wasn't done. A loud crack echoed through the night as another tree toppled into the water nearby, sending waves crashing toward them. Thunder tensed, his instincts screaming again. He nudged the cradle free and pushed it ahead, diving back into the water before the waves could sweep them away. Through it all, Noah's cries grew softer, but they didn't stop. Thunder's heart ached with every sound. He didn't understand human words, but he didn't need to. That cry was universal, a plea for help, for safety, for love. And Thunder wasn't about to fail him. By the time the first hint of dawn broke through the storm clouds, the floodwaters had carried them far from the farm. Thunder didn't know where they were, but he kept moving. His legs felt like lead, his chest burned with every breath, but he refused to give up. Ahead, the faint outline of a hill appeared, its peak above the water. It was small, but it was land. Solid, dry land. Thunder aimed for it, his body aching with every stroke. As the sun struggled to rise, Thunder finally reached the hill. He nudged the cradle onto the muddy slope, making sure it was stable. Then, with a deep sigh, he collapsed beside it, his body shaking from exhaustion. Noah's cries had quieted, replaced by soft, hiccuping breaths. Thunder rested his head against the cradle, his eyes closing as the first rays of sunlight touched them both. The storm had taken everything: the farm, the fences, the familiar safety of home. But it hadn't taken their bond. Thunder had made sure of that, and as he drifted into a brief, exhausted sleep, he knew this was just the beginning of their journey. The rain had slowed, and the wind wasn't screaming anymore, but the water was still high and dangerous. Thunder woke up, his body stiff and aching from the night's battle. He barely had the strength to stand, but he forced himself up. The cradle. His heart leaped as he turned his head. It wasn't there. Panic hit him like a lightning bolt. He scanned the muddy hill and the swirling water below, his eyes darting around desperately. Then he saw a piece of wood floating downstream. And on it? Noah. The baby was lying there, curled up in his soggy blanket, his tiny chest rising and falling. The sight of him alive sent a surge of relief through Thunder, but there was no time to celebrate. The wood was wobbling dangerously, tipping with each wave. Without hesitation, Thunder plunged back into the water. His legs burned from exhaustion, but his determination was unshakable. He swam toward the makeshift raft, his ears pinned back and his eyes locked on Noah. The current was strong, dragging the wood farther away with every second. Thunder swam harder, his powerful strokes cutting through the water. The gap between him and Noah closed inch by inch, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, he reached the floating piece of wood. Carefully, he nudged it with his nose, steadying it. Noah stirred, letting out a weak little cry. Thunder's heart broke at the sound. The baby was cold, tired, and scared, but he was alive. Thunder had to act fast. He gently gripped the edge of the wood with his teeth, careful not to jostle Noah too much. Using all his strength, he guided the makeshift raft toward higher ground. Every kick of his legs sent waves of pain through his body, but he didn't stop. At last, Thunder spotted at a rocky ledge rising above the floodwaters. It wasn't much, but it was solid, and it was dry. With one final push, Thunder reached the ledge. He nudged the wood onto the rocks and watched as it came to a stop. Noah was safe. But the journey wasn't over. The ledge provided a moment of rest, but Thunder knew they needed better shelter. The air was still cold, and the baby was shivering. Thunder scanned the area, his sharp eyes catching the outline of a cave tucked into the hillside. It was small and dark, but it was high above the water and out of the wind. Gently, Thunder grabbed Noah's blanket with his teeth and lifted him onto his back. He moved slowly, carefully, making sure the baby stayed secure. Then he climbed toward the cave, his hooves slipping slightly on the wet rocks. When they reached the cave, Thunder ducked inside, setting Noah down on a patch of dry ground. It wasn't much, but it was better than being out in the open. The cave was cool and quiet, the walls lined with moss and small stones. Thunder stood over Noah, his body acting as a shield against the wind. The baby let out a soft whimper, and Thunder lowered his head, nuzzling him gently. It was his way of saying, "You're safe now. I've got you." But safety was a fragile thing. As the hours passed, Thunder kept watch. His ears flicked at every sound: the distant crash of water, the rustle of leaves, and once the soft growl of something in the distance. He didn't know what it was, but it was enough to make his muscles tense. The predators hadn't disappeared. If anything, they were hungrier than ever. The flood had displaced everything, leaving animals scrambling for food and shelter. Thunder knew he'd have to stay alert, ready to defend Noah if anything came too close. Despite the danger, there was something peaceful about the cave. The sound of dripping water echoed softly, and the light filtering in from the entrance painted the walls in muted colors. Thunder let out a deep breath, his body relaxing just a little. He thought about the family. About Mr. and Mrs. Thompson and their desperate cries as the cradle was swept away. He hoped they were safe. He hoped they were searching for Noah, even now. But deep down, he knew it might be days or longer before they found each other again. For now, it was up to him. Thunder curled his body around Noah, his warmth keeping the baby from the chill of the cave. As the baby drifted off to sleep, Thunder's eyes grew heavy. He couldn't let himself rest for long, but a short nap might help. As he drifted into a light sleep, memories came flooding back. He saw Noah's tiny hand reaching out to grab his mane. He remembered the way the baby's laugh could make even the gloomiest day feel like summer. Those moments weren't just memories, they were promises. Promises Thunder wasn't about to break. When he woke, the storm had finally stopped. The sky outside the cave was gray but calm, the floodwaters beginning to recede. It was a small sign of hope. Morning arrived quietly. The storm was gone, leaving a strange stillness in its wake. Outside the cave, the world was unrecognizable. Trees leaned at impossible angles, the ground was littered with debris, and the once familiar landscape now looked like the work of a careless giant. Thunder stood at the cave's entrance, his ears swiveling as he listened to the silence. He glanced back at Noah, who was still bundled in his soggy blanket, his tiny face peaceful in sleep. For a moment, Thunder let himself feel a flicker of hope. They had survived the worst of it. But survival wasn't the same as safety. The floodwaters were receding, but the land was still dangerous. Thunder knew they couldn't stay in the cave forever. Noah needed his family, and Thunder needed to find food and water before exhaustion claimed them both. He nudged the baby gently with his nose, a soft whinny escaping his lips. Noah stirred, his little hands twitching. Thunder gave a low, reassuring snort. "Come on, kiddo," he seemed to say. We've got a long road ahead. Thunder crouched low, using his body like a platform. Carefully, he lifted Noah onto his back, making sure the baby was secure. It wasn't a perfect setup, but it would have to do. With one last look at the cave, Thunder stepped out into the muddy wilderness. The ground squished beneath Thunder's hooves as he navigated through the wreckage. Broken branches and overturned logs were everywhere, creating an obstacle course he had to pick his way through. The air smelled of wet earth and decay, a stark reminder of the storm's wrath. Noah's small cries broke the silence every now and then, but Thunder's presence seemed to comfort him. Every time the baby whimpered, Thunder turned his head to check on him, giving him a soft nudge or a gentle snort. The journey was slow and exhausting. At one point, Thunder stepped into a patch of mud that nearly swallowed his leg. He pulled himself free with a grunt, pausing to catch his breath. It felt like the earth itself was trying to hold them back. Have you ever walked through mud so thick it felt like your shoes might never come out? That's what it was like for Thunder, except he had 4 legs to worry about. As they moved farther from the cave, signs of life began to emerge. A pair of deer darted past, their eyes wide with fear. Birds perched on broken branches, their feathers ruffled and wet. Thunder even spotted a raccoon clinging to a piece of driftwood, its tiny paws trembling. The flood hadn't just hit the farm. It had hit everything. At one point, Thunder came across a group of cows stranded on a small island of grass. They mooed pitifully, their usual calm replaced by panic. Thunder slowed for a moment, his ears twitching. He couldn't help them, but their cries added to the weight in his chest. Farther along, he encountered something more threatening, a stray dog. The animal was thin and scrappy, its ribs showing through its fur. It growled low as Thunder approached, its eyes darting between the horse and the baby on his back. Thunder froze, his muscles tense. The dog wasn't just scared, it was hungry. For a moment they stared at each other. The dog took a step forward, baring its teeth, but Thunder didn't back down. He let out a sharp, warning snort, his hoof stomping against the muddy ground. The dog hesitated, its tail lowering slightly. Finally it turned and slunk away, disappearing into the brush. Thunder exhaled, his heart pounding. He glanced back at Noah, who was still safe and sound, his tiny face scrunched up in sleep. Close one, Thunder might have thought. As the day wore on, the exhaustion became harder to ignore. Thunder's stomach growled loudly, and he could feel the weakness creeping into his legs. But he pushed on, his instincts guiding him. Eventually, he found a patch of grass that had survived the flood, tucked away on a small hill. It wasn't much, but it was green and fresh. Thunder lowered his head, tearing at the blades hungrily. Noah let out a soft cry, his voice cracking with thirst. Thunder's ears perked up. He scanned the area, searching for water. Not far away, he spotted a shallow puddle where the flood had receded. Carefully, Thunder approached. The water was muddy, but it was all they had. He dipped his nose in, taking a drink before lowering his head to Noah. Using his nose, he nudged a bit of water toward the baby's lips. Noah let out a soft gurgle, his tiny mouth moving to take in the moisture. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to keep them going. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, Thunder found a small clearing surrounded by trees. It wasn't as safe as the cave, but it would have to do for the night. He lowered himself to the ground, letting Noah slide gently onto the grass. The baby cooed softly, his tiny hands reaching out. Thunder curled his body around him, shielding him from the cool evening air. The stars began to peek out, their light shimmering against the darkening sky. Thunder let out a long, tired breath, his eyes heavy with exhaustion. The flood had taken so much. The farm, the fences, the family, they were all gone, scattered by the storm. But as Thunder looked down at Noah, he felt a spark of hope. They were still here, still fighting. And tomorrow? Tomorrow they'd keep going. Together. The morning sun broke through the clouds, casting long shadows over the soaked and battered landscape. Thunder was tired, his body heavy with exhaustion, but his heart pushed him forward. Each step brought him closer to something he barely dared to hope for: home. For days, he and Noah had trudged through the wreckage. Thunder had dodged fallen trees, climbed slippery hills, and faced more dangers than he cared to remember. Every ache in his muscles was a reminder of how far they'd come. But now, the air smelled different. Familiar. The farm. It was still far away, but Thunder's instincts told him they were close. He paused on a hilltop, his ears swiveling. In the distance he could make out the faint sounds of voices, shouts, cries, the clatter of equipment. Rescue teams. And Thunder's heart thumped hard in his chest. Was the family there? Were they okay? And what would they think when they saw him carrying Noah on his back? He took a deep breath and started down the hill. The closer they got, the louder the sounds became. Thunder could see people now, rescuers in bright jackets and villagers helping to clear debris. The farm was a shadow of what it had been. The barn was half collapsed, the fields a muddy mess, and the house looked like it had barely withstood the storm. Thunder hesitated at the edge of the chaos. His hooves sank into the soft earth as he stood there, watching. What if they didn't see him? What if something went wrong? Then, a voice cut through the noise. Noah. Noah. It was Mrs. Thompson. Her voice was hoarse, her face pale, and her hands clutched the remains of a soaked blanket. She looked desperate, scanning the horizon as if willing her baby to appear. Thunder's ears perked up. That was all he needed. He let out a loud whinny, a sound that turned heads in an instant. People stopped what they were doing. Eyes widened. Gasps rippled through the crowd as they saw him, a muddy, battered horse carrying a baby on his back. And then the chaos turned into something else entirely. Mrs. Thompson screamed, dropping the blanket and running toward Thunder. Tears streamed down her face as she stumbled over the uneven ground. Mr. Thompson was right behind her, his face a mix of disbelief and relief. Thunder stepped forward carefully, lowering his head to help them lift Noah from his back. The baby let out a soft cry as Mrs. Thompson cradled him in her arms. She sobbed, clutching him tightly, her body shaking with relief. "Oh my God, he's alive! He's alive," she cried. Mr. Thompson put a hand on Thunder's neck, his voice thick with emotion. "You did it, boy. You brought him back." Thunder let out a soft snort, his ears flicking back. He was too tired to feel anything but relief, but deep down, he knew he'd done what he'd set out to do. The rescue team crowded around, their voices buzzing with amazement. Someone brought a blanket for Noah, wrapping him up tightly. Others inspected Thunder, checking for injuries and marveling at his condition. "How did he survive out there?" one of the rescuers asked. "Not just survive," another added, shaking their head. "He saved the baby. This horse is incredible." Thunder stood there, his body trembling with exhaustion but his spirit unbroken. He watched as the family huddled together, their tears of joy a stark contrast to the devastation around them. It was a bittersweet moment. The farm was in ruins, the flood had taken so much, and the world felt fragile. But Noah was safe, and for now, that was enough. Mrs. Thompson approached Thunder, her hand resting gently on his muzzle. Her eyes were red from crying, but there was a warmth in her smile. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for bringing him back to me." Thunder lowered his head, leaning into her touch. If he could speak, he might have said, "He's your baby. Of course I brought him back." Word of Thunder's heroics spread quickly. By the end of the day, neighbors and villagers had gathered at the farm, each one eager to see the horse that had braved the flood. They brought treats, apples, carrots, and even sugar cubes, piling them into a makeshift trough as a gesture of gratitude. Thunder, still tired but hungry, accepted the feast with quiet dignity. Children giggled and patted his sides, their eyes wide with admiration. One boy tugged on his mother's sleeve and asked, "Can we get a horse like him?" Even the rescue workers joined in, snapping pictures and telling each other, "This one's going in the record books." For a brief moment, the farm wasn't a place of tragedy. It was a place of celebration, filled with laughter, relief, and gratitude. As night fell, the crowd began to disperse. The Thompson family stayed close to Thunder, setting up a small tent near the remains of the barn. They weren't ready to let him out of their sight. Mrs. Thompson sat with Noah in her lap, her hand resting on Thunder's mane. "You're not just a horse," she said softly. "You're family." Thunder didn't understand the words, but he felt the love in her voice. He closed his eyes, letting himself relax for the first time in days. The stars came out, twinkling brightly against the dark sky. The world was still broken, but in that little corner of it, there was hope. Thunder had done what no one else could. He had saved a life. And in doing so, he had reminded everyone of something important, even in the darkest moments. Courage and loyalty could light the way. And as he drifted into a well-deserved sleep, Thunder knew one thing for sure. He wasn't just a horse anymore. He was a hero.